Rebonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à la dernière séance du premier colloque étudiant du CRIHN. On a le plaisir d'accueillir Amanda Montague pour notre plénière. So, hello everyone again and welcome to the last session of the first student conference of the CRIHN. We are delighted to have Dr. Amanda Montague among us. Well, not technically among us. She was planning to come here and deliver her speech in person, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, she had to cancel her trip last minute. But we are happy to have her at least with us online. Amanda Montague received her PhD from the University of Ottawa in 2019. Her dissertation, Mobile Memories, Canadian Cultural Memory in the Digital Age, considered the impact of mobile technologies and locative media on everyday experiences of memory and place. From 2019 to 2022, Amanda held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Sherman Center for Digital Scholarship in McMaster University's library. In this role, she collaborated with librarians and information specialists to advance digital scholarship activities across campus through course instruction, pedagogical consultations, and digital tool training workshops. Recently, Amanda was appointed to the newly created position of educational developer for community engaged teaching and learning at McMaster. Congratulations on that. She brings extensive experience in digital project-based learning and digital partnership projects to this role. Her pedagogy employs a model of experiential learning common to digital humanities practice that looks to engage students with course material in new ways, using digital tools and methods to promote collaboration, creativity, and community building. In her current research and teaching, she continues to experiment with digital storytelling tools and methods to facilitate engagement both within the classroom and with communities outside the university. And the title of Dr. Montague's talk today is Affective and Embodied Memory in Pedagogical Practices of Digital Storytelling. So welcome again, Amanda. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay. As Parham said, I really did want to be there with you in person, but I'm glad that I can join virtually. And I just wanted to take a moment to tell you really how excited I am to see so much interest in the topic of memory and digital humanities. It's something I've been working in for many years. It's very close to my heart. So it's wonderful to see this interest because, you know, it hasn't always been the case. And especially to see this coming out of a grad student cohort in particular is just so lovely. And on that same note, I'm just so thrilled to be able to be part of this inaugural grad student conference with CRIHN. I've been lucky for the past few years in my postdoc to be able to work closely with graduate students to support their digital scholarship projects. You know, the work that you do is so important. We really look to you, our emerging scholars, to set the tone for what kinds of supports are needed for our DH programs to evolve so that we can create research and teaching environments that are more inclusive, more relevant, and more equitable. So a big thank you to the organizing committee for the time that they put into making this conference possible. And especially a big thank you to Parham, who, to use a museum term, was really my docent in preparing for this talk, answering my emails, making sure I had everything, all the information I needed. His professionalism and kindness was unmatched, and I know that this is representative of the entire organizing committee. So thank you. Un grand merci pour votre invitation. And that is the extent of my French. And I am truly sorry for this. I actually spend a lot of my time apologizing for my limited French because my husband's family is French. So communication can be a little bit tricky. But I have a 7-month-old daughter, and we plan to raise her in both languages. So hopefully I'll learn as she learns. So if you invite me back next year, you know, my French should be better. At the very least, I should have the vocabulary of a 1-year-old. So that's something. But let me get going. I'll share my screen here. Hopefully you can see it. So I'm going to start my talk in a bit of an unconventional way, I suppose. I wanted to share with you a little bit about how I came to the field of digital humanities, how I came to my topic of digital cultural memory while doing my PhD, what led to the dissertation, and how that's really shaped the work that I've done and continue to do since completing the PhD program. So my PhD is in English literature, and when I began the program, there weren't a lot of resources available for DH. There was no DH program at the time. I want to be clear, you know, this was 10 years ago and it's changed drastically now. There's a lot of support for digital humanities. But when I started, there wasn't a whole lot going on in my department in DH. So all of that to say, I didn't go into my PhD thinking that I was going to do digital scholarship, but I was interested in cultural memory. I went to Ottawa to work with a prominent scholar in Canadian cultural memory studies, and she was fantastic. So as I was pulling together my thesis project, I was interested in memory narratives in Canada, both national and then everyday personal memory. And I started to think about digital sites of memory. And one of the first things that I encountered was this 9/11 museum audio guide. And this really prompted a turn for me towards digital tools and approaches in memory narratives. So this was a mobile app called Explore 9/11 that offered 3 tours of the 9/11 museum in New York. And I started thinking about what apps like this offer sites of memory, particularly the 9/11 Memorial Museum, which is a site structured around loss, emotional loss, physical loss. As a memorial museum, it's predominantly object poor. So it's comprised of, the collection is comprised of narratives, stories, witness testimony, video and audio clips, and memories shared by visitors. And the mobile app captures many of these affective qualities in the collection through multimedia, through videos and photos, through background music and interviews. And so more than just an audio guide, this app really functioned as a multimodal form of storytelling and a rich digital site of memory in itself. And it does this kind of work of playing to both the global and local audiences. So of course, you don't have to be at the site to physically access the app. You can access it anywhere in the world as long as you have, of course, a smartphone and internet connectivity. So at the local level, the app is augmenting the physical site, which is coded with these complex sentiments of trauma, tragedy, reconstruction, but it's also consciously global. And it's promoting narratives that have a specific kind of American post 9/11 patriotism and identity formation attached to them. It's because it's giving virtual access to distant users. So from here, I started thinking more about mobile media as tools in the transmission of memory narratives and how they work to facilitate connections between memory and place. And this opened up the field to the kinds of memory apps that I could consider beyond just museum audio guides, to apps that were more playful or imaginative in their dealings with the past, ones that used archival collections, ones that crowdsourced, ones that gamified, and ones that prompted participatory mapping. And each of these forms of digital storytelling really afforded their own opportunities and their own constraints for memory narratives and for public engagement. So what my thesis project really became was a theorization of the relationship between technology, memory, and place, between material and virtual attachments to place, and essentially an exploration of a variety of digital storytelling tools in the transmission of memory narratives. So at the time, you know, much scholarship had been written on locative media and mobile media practices when I began this project, but none were really in the specific context of cultural memory, and certainly none in the context of Canadian cultural memory. Moreover, much of the work on digital apps and locative media was interested in place, network, embodiment, but none were extensively talking about memory. While in memory studies at the time, we were seeing, you know, an understanding of digital tools basically approached for their capacity to be vast storehouses of memory, with a focus on permanence, impermanence of digital memory storage in contrast to its analog counterparts, and not really what I was interested in, which was the phenomenological links between technological practices or mobile phone practices specifically and everyday experiences of memory and place. So at the time, I think what my thesis brought to the field was an interest in digital storytelling that approached memory not strictly on the level of representation, but on the level of everyday quotidian memory interactions and the technologies that can be used to facilitate them. So while I was piecing together these aspects of the dissertation, I was also involved in some other projects. One was the creation of the Ottawa-based cultural memory workshops. And this was a workshop series that I co-developed with a colleague of mine. Our goal was really to create a community of practice around some of our shared interests in cultural memory, and specifically to engage members of the academic community with the general public to explore these questions of presence of the past at a local level in the city of Ottawa. And, you know, this was very grassroots. We didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't have any funding. We just started planning activities and got people together and, you know, tried some things. And I know that that sounds really vague, but it really was cobbled together. But we ended up having a lot of success with it. We would partner with different groups around the city. On the screen, I've just listed a few. Sometimes we would work with a museum in an existing museum collection, and we do some kind of digital intervention using some open tools like HistoryPin, for example. We would also work with groups like Ottawa Detours or Jane's Walks to put on walking tours. And, you know, through this work, I really started to become interested in these kinds of outward-facing projects that fostered academic and non-academic partnerships, that shared authority, that pushed academic discourse into more community-based engagement. And, you know, really this turn toward collaborative, praxis-based research was something that really positively impacted the trajectory of my dissertation at the time. Very simply, I couldn't adequately theorize about these interactive digital memory experiences without also participating in them, building them, or testing them with participants. And, you know, this is really at the heart of what we do in digital humanities, as all of us here know. It's that combination of theory and praxis, the sharing of skills and expertise to build collaborative projects. And when I opened myself up to this approach, it really allowed me to come at my research questions in more experiential and experimental ways, and really kind of breathe some new life into that thesis project. And I really came to understand the value of collaboration. You know, coming from a discipline like English literature, that was kind of a foreign concept to me at the time. And it really was a game changer during my PhD. So in addition to this, during the PhD, I also had the opportunity to help develop a course for undergraduate students about Shakespeare in performance in Canada. And the goal of this course was to engage students in primary source archival research, meet with artists and practitioners in the community, and build all of this research into an interactive digital exhibit using Omeka. So for this course, I was hired as a TA, and I worked very closely with a team of librarians, as well as the main instructor of the course, to support students in building their archival projects on Omeka. And it was through sort of contributing to this course that I came to realize the value that digital pedagogical projects have in building partnerships with librarians, with technical experts. And I could really see firsthand how students work in digital environments, see where they struggle, and see also the value that these kinds of collaborative environments have for developing a skills-based education. And so this is really why I love digital pedagogy and digital pedagogical projects. Not only does it bring my research and teaching interests into alignment in a very tangible way, but I do believe we can best serve our undergraduate students by creating environments that are both theoretically rigorous and experiential, because this sort of further equips them for whatever they have in store after graduation. So all of this led me to my postdoc at the Sherman Center at McMaster, where I really got to solidify my experience working in a collaborative research environment. So as Parham mentioned in my intro, the Sherman Center is a library-based digital scholarship center. So as such, it's really rooted in a library ethos of knowledge and resource sharing. So we would support researchers and research projects across campus in any field. For instructors, grad students, undergraduate students, anyone who was looking to do digital scholarship. And so here I would build programming, I did some tool training, I did research consultations for a variety of projects. And I was also able to build my own courses, drawing on some of that earlier work that I did in digital humanities course design during my PhD. I taught an intro to digital humanities course for 3 years. You can see a little clip of our course website on the screen here. And I also taught a few other interdisciplinary experiential learning courses. I'll talk more about them in a few minutes. And of course, now as an educational developer, I get to continue to build on this work in digital pedagogy and course design. So, I share my journey with you in the hope that it might illustrate how some of the different pieces of my work have fit together over the years. Not because I think it's exemplary, I don't, but I hope that it might resonate with you and your own work as graduate students and how that work might evolve in different contexts. I think that sometimes it can be hard to really see how all the pieces fit together, especially in grad school. You're really so heavily invested in the research, you have to be, you're really in the thick of it. But zooming out a bit to consider the different contexts that you're working in or could be working in, to think really about the why of your research, not just the what, is really valuable. And just one more thing I'll say quickly before moving on. When I share this story about how my work has evolved over the years, I realize it appears very linear and very clear, but I really assure you that most of the time I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. I really felt like I was fumbling around in the dark. I was grabbing at strings of things that interested me. But I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more later if there's questions. So as I move into the bulk of my talk, I'm going to highlight some of the salient points from my research on mobile technology and memory, in part because it's pertinent to the themes of this conference, but also to demonstrate how they've actively shaped my pedagogical practice, not only in the course content and assignments that I've created, but also in how we interact as a classroom community, and a community that's been distinctly virtual for a few years during the pandemic. Okay, so in my research on a range of digital storytelling tools, from locative media narratives to social media and crowdsourced heritage archives to urban mobile games and playful mapping, I've tried to make a case that the affective and embodied elements of mobile technology, or the mobile phone specifically, make it particularly well suited to the access and dissemination of memory narratives. So this is to say, if we isolate the mobile phone as the technological site where many of these digital interactions happen, it's important to recognize the relational ontology of the mobile phone itself, or what Mark Seifer and Ingrid Richardson have called the imbrication of the social, the corporeal, the material, and the technical, particularly because in the context of contemporary memory practices, memory operates from a similar set of dynamics between the body and the physical and social environment. As Astrid Errol and Anne Rigney have noted, remembering is as much a matter of acting out a relationship to the past from a particular point in the present as it is a matter of preserving and retrieving earlier stories. At the same time, digital technologies already modify our relationship to time, as individuals are developing what Anna Reading has called an extended present, which impacts our daily sense of temporality and practices of self-narration, and reinforces the idea that identity formation is something in process, ongoing, dynamic. Memory, too, follows a similar model as something dynamic and directed in and from the present. When we use digital technologies to prompt a site-specific memory encounter, either through participation in a locative media narrative or in a heritage group that's assembled online on social media, this sense of extended present calls attention to the ongoing presence of the past by foregrounding it as something that's constantly made and remade and integrated into the flow of networked life. So what does this look like in practical terms? I'm going to isolate two quick examples: monuments and virtual memory communities. So for site-specific narratives, so let's say monuments, historic sites, this could be a virtual walking tour, an AR installation, a site-specific mobile game, a QR code, whatever. We first need to start from a theorization of place. So following the feminist geographer Doreen Massey and others, places are understood as an assemblage, as more than just their physical location, constructed by the ongoing accumulation of stories, memories, and social practices. As Massey has demonstrated, an individual's relationship to place is always in the process of being made, never finished, never closed. Places are constituted through mobility, through one's experience of the interconnectedness within and among places. This is most famously theorized by Michel de Certeau, but we see it in other phenomenologists like Yi-Fu Tuan. The idea of space as a practice place, one that's inhabited frequently, that becomes meaningful through experience, through movement, through familiarity, through the stories that we attach to it. But as we know, with the influx of mobile technology, our experiences of everyday place is also constituted by interactions on the mobile phone. Eric Gordon and Adriana de Souza y Silva have classified this as net locality, or the idea that with location-aware technologies, we can't separate the material space from the location-based information embedded within it. These contexts unfold on themselves. So the concept of net locality requires us to understand places as hybrid, as composed of physically co-present people and things, as well as our network connections and digital information. So through its very form, the smartphone conditions us to hybridity, making us comfortable operating in both the realm of the virtual and the physical, where the toggling between the two becomes part of daily life. So in the context of a locative media narrative, the experience of having a foot in both worlds of the past and the present, of the virtual and the physical environment, works to really take memory out of the realm of the fixed and static and places the user at the center of that dialectical relationship between the past and present. So while monuments tend to make a claim to permanence through their physical materiality and their constructions of symbolic unity, we know that the materiality of the monument and its anchoring to a specific place subjects it to changing spatial and social frameworks. And it allows for a variety of physical interventions and inscriptions over time, including things like nationally sanctioned commemoration or as a site of protest and defacement. So when the purpose of the monument is to reinforce a hegemonic narrative of nation building, virtual space becomes an important place for delivering counter-hegemonic memory narratives and spatial histories. So as I've argued elsewhere, locative media apps foreground acts of engagement that expand James Young's definition of the counter-monument. For Young, counter-monuments provide a valuable counter-index to the ways that time, memory, and history in its current form intersect at any memorial site. And they do so by providing opportunities for embodied interaction and engagement. So like the counter-monument, mobile locative apps insist on the dynamic quality of memory, a quality that relies on human engagement and interaction. This not only foregrounds the body as a site of memory, as a site of the memory transmission, but also memory as a lived process that works in relation to human temporality. Here on the screen are just a few examples of locative media narratives, decoding art on the left, and a statue here on the right of Dr. J. Marion Sims, which is in New York, in Manhattan. The statue was later removed because of his ties to the exploitation of enslaved and immigrant women in his medical practice. And after the statue was removed, the empty space became a site for some AR installations. So let's switch quickly to another instance of digital memory for a moment. virtual memory communities. What I mean by this specifically is crowdsourced digital archives and social media memory communities. And this is another category of digital memory that I classify as mobile for two reasons. One, we see the virtual memory communities are really responsible for moving memory discourse outside of the realm of the official institution and into the everyday in the hands of the general public. And two, in digitally networked memory communities, we see memory work integrated into the flow of daily work life in digital social practices. So if, as we know, following Maurice Halbach, that memory cannot be separated from the social frameworks that give rise to it, how do online social environments impact the memory work that's being carried out on them? Certainly, traditional practices of sharing memory between family and close groups through this physical co-present storytelling, this changes, of course, with the digital memory community. When these older practices move online and start to occur between digital strangers, we see the exteriorization of the intimate and affective practices of memory and remembering. Some examples here on the screen: HistoryPin, as I mentioned before, a great open source tool for sharing and pinning of archival photos to geographic space. Sharing personal collections, it's a great tool for capturing smaller local histories around the world. And then on the right, social media groups. Often these were on Facebook many years ago when Facebook was a thing. We see this, Lost Ottawa as an example, but many cities, of course, have these kind of lost Belleville, lost, city examples. Crowdsourcing platforms such as these can be really compelling, a really compelling place for mobilizing communities around a shared cultural experience and history. According to Roger Simon, remembering through social platforms such as these put physically distant people in relation as they express and remake their connections to a specific historical event and to each other, or what he refers to as remembering together. Drawing from Lauren Berlant's notion of the affective historical present as something that's being made and lived through, Simon insists that these practices of remembering together can create a viscerally felt historical present. So when a personal story or a photograph is shared on a digital platform like Facebook or HistoryPin, the user's retrieving their memory in part, in piecemeal, and by extension reaches out not only to a past time, but to a digitally co-present individuals, imagined or real otherwise. So in the act of remembering through social media, the affective and viscerally felt continuousness of the past recirculates in the present among multiple users, fostering a sense of immediacy and intimacy that is often characteristic of these digital memory communities for the group that they serve. So because of this, scholars like Neil Silberman and Margaret Purser have claimed that social media have the potential to restore a sense of collective memory. However, defining memory practices in digital participatory culture as collective restricts us to an outdated notion of collectivity that masks some of the nuances of the memory practices that are at work here. So to unpack this further, we can look to the theorization of collective versus collected and connective memory. In collective memory, the two cultures, Jeffrey Olick presents the concept of collected memory in opposition to collective, where collective memory is thought to be a universal, singular act of memory. Collected memory is the aggregation of individual memories of members of a group. This concept of collective memory foregrounds the individual as the memory maker and the subject doing the remembering. Similarly, Andrew Hoskins proposes the idea of connective memory as more representative of the memory practices carried out online. This idea of connective memory stems from the concept of the multitude, following Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. Like the internet itself, the multitude follows a distributed network pattern where the various nodes remain different but all connected via the web. So connective memory, according to Hoskins, accounts for the unique memory of the individual while also recognizing its reliance on digital connective traces. So as such, connectivity or connective memory bridges the gap between collected and collective in a way that embraces variety, difference, multiplicity as something that's constructed in the present through networked connectivity, but still produces a semblance or a sense of community. So, what does this all mean? In the fall of 2019, as a way to further explore some of these key considerations around memory, place, and community, and really put the theory into practice, I developed an experiential learning course that would look closely at public spaces in the city of Hamilton to understand how local knowledge, history, and memory continue to haunt and encode life in the present. It was originally called You Are Here, Engaging Public Spaces Through Digital Storytelling. And the goal of this course was to explore what constitutes good public spaces. Often we see in urban development, we see urban development to be fixated solely on the new and on the future. And this kind of takes a terra nullius approach. But if we consider what came before and try to uncover traces of the past, we can build a more nuanced understanding of who these spaces serve or don't serve, and rethink what we value about them. And this is what I've called, in other contexts, pass forward placemaking. So as you can see in my original module objectives for the course, it was through collaboration and community engagement that as a class, we were going to employ a combination of fieldwork, archival work, crowdsourcing, to trace some of the memories and histories of public spaces and create a digital site-specific narrative. So this course was set for May of 2020, and I pitched it in the fall of 2019. So, but as we all know, by March of 2020, the world looked very different because of COVID-19. We had shifted to remote learning. So the experiential components, as traditionally understood for this class, weren't possible. Not to mention, because of the lockdown, we couldn't even access public spaces at all. But at the same time, the key questions about the value and the use of public spaces that this course was asking were becoming more vital and more relevant than I had ever even imagined when I originally pitched the topic. So one of the first changes I made was renaming the course to You Aren't Here, which was a bit of a joke, of course, and at first, signaled the removal of bodies in public spaces because of the lockdown. But as I developed this new iteration of the course, I started to draw more heavily on the framework of hybrid space. And so my new approach was really informed by these ideas of net locality and telepresence. So drawing from locative media memory narrative, which understands places to be hybrid, where physical space and the virtual information encoded in it are not separate layers, but enfolded contexts, I started to consider how we might bring this to bear on our remote engagement with public spaces. As Adriana de Souza Silva argues, interactions with a mobile device are necessarily embedded in the environment and also part of other contexts. So in other words, the idea of telepresence is that we can hold disparate contexts simultaneously. This is what we do with a locative media memory narrative. We hold the past and the present simultaneously. And it's the body that grounds these disparate contexts. So in other words, notions of telepresence always come back to the body because it's through identifying the body in place that we come to understand the relationship between here and there. So if we're conditioned to blur time-space parameters in our daily use of technology, maybe we can still have a meaningful place-based interaction using a digital simulation like Google Street View. So just because we're here at home doesn't necessarily negate our ability to connect to a remote public space, or just because our classmates are there elsewhere in physical space doesn't negate our ability to work collaboratively here in the digital space. So in addition to this, I started to rely more heavily on how we might use memory, which also has that element of time-space blurring, how we might use memory or our memories of public spaces of the time spent out in the world while we were contained at home to foster a sense of digital co-presence. So these were important questions for the theoretical framework of the course, but more than this, from a critical digital pedagogy perspective, questions of embodiment are also important to framing our work in the virtual classroom more broadly. And, this can be tricky because as we've all experienced with virtual learning, technologies in the classroom are used in ways that typically gesture to, but allied, meaningful, embodied presence. Things like virtual lectures, camera on policies in our syllabi, learning management systems that limit community building to an interaction of post once, comment twice. These can place limits on meaningful distance interaction. As Sean Michael Morris has argued, most digital learning tools do very little to facilitate community connection and transparency. So therefore, rather than using a digital tool because we have to, critical digital pedagogy asks, how might we use it to build emerging spaces for new forms of collaboration and community building? And this echoes a similar sentiment that we see in critiques of the widespread adoption of digital tools by museums and heritage institutions, which asks, how can the technology be used to create emerging cultural spaces for meaningful interactions and dialogue? Likewise, how can we use online learning spaces in transformative ways? So for me, this was about applying ideas of body screen ontology to reconstitute transparency, human connection, and community in the virtual classroom setting. And ultimately less about what digital tool we selected to do the work and more about the key considerations, the practices, and the overall goals that we hope to achieve. So as Sean Michael Morris has noted, even when our work seems to happen upon a screen, it must keep humans in mind. And for this particular course, that really meant coming back to the human element of the cultural moment that we were in. So how might we enact a virtually co-present memory community, bearing witness to the global crisis that we were in, recognizing the turmoil, the trauma, the stress, the uncertainty that comes with an event of that magnitude. So it meant really holding space for this in the classroom and bringing that into the framework of the course itself. So here's, I know it's hard to see, this is just really a small snippet of the projects, but as a class, we had to be very purposeful in giving ourselves permission to think creatively and critically about our current cultural moment without negating or ignoring the very real crisis that we were experiencing, many of us in disproportionate ways, in order to imagine a better future and better uses for our community spaces. So this is just a small selection of the projects. So the way it worked was students were assigned a specific type of public space. So a parking lot, a city, street, a park, and then asked to find a representative space in their neighborhood using Google Street View. And from there, we used a tool called ThingLink to create virtual tags that outlined a redesign for public space, thinking about how these spaces might serve more diverse communities in the future, drawing from what we know from our past experience as a place and what we were struggling with in our widespread access to these spaces. And many of these tags had voiceover narration attached to them, which was really interesting in highlighting the tension between presence and absence, with a disembodied voice kind of commenting on these visuals of empty space. And just quickly, this is a view of the resulting hypertext. So you can see how the projects were linked together. The different spaces were juxtaposed so that geographically distant spaces were brought into relationship with each other. In this way, the individual projects were brought into conversation in really meaningful ways. And we could see emerging shared concerns and really a shared responsibility in this sort of spirit of collaboration, recognizing a real need for collective action. Students really were proud of their work. They wanted to share their ideas with local city councilors. So in fact, this was a very healing exercise. There was something really cathartic in these projects, rooted in that idea of connective memory. And asking students to draw from personal experience, the memory of life in the before times, reflect on their local public spaces, and then share those experiences more broadly. They were able to really see firsthand how those individually collected memories intersected in digital space to become connective memory. And this was really a very powerful thing. And, through the passing of affect on the screen in grappling with these questions and this kind of overarching collective uncertainty, we were really able to approximate a classroom community online. And this in turn really allowed students to connect back to their own communities from a distance in a very viscerally felt way, recognizing the role that we all play in contributing to the development of diverse, vibrant, and forward-thinking cities. So I'm going to leave it here for now. And of course, there's time for questions and discussion.